Some portraits watch longer than the living. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. Your voices matter here. Let's uncover the gaze. Hawthorne Grange had not seen such animation in years. The village of Stourfield, ordinarily content with its measured pace of life, punctuated by the ringing of the church bells and the polite exchange of hedgerow gossip, now hummed with anticipation. A white marquee had been erected upon the manicured lawns. Tables dressed in lace cloths displayed tiered trays of cucumber sandwiches, seed cakes, and pale pink meringues that trembled delicately in the breeze. The occasion was both charitable and celebratory. The unveiling of a long-lost family portrait recently restored and returned to the ancestral home. Now Miss Marple sat in a wicker chair near the edge of the lawn, knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Her pale blue eyes, magnified slightly by her spectacles, appeared to rest vaguely upon the hydrangeas bordering the gravel path. In truth, she was observing everything. The owner of Hawthorne Grange, Mrs. Honoria Barrington, stood near the covered easel positioned beneath the sycamore tree. Tall and impeccably dressed in dove-grey silk, she possessed the posture of a woman who had long ago learned that dignity could compensate for dwindling fortune. The Barrington estate, while still impressive, had been whispered about in recent years, its upkeep costly, its income uncertain. At her side lingered her nephew, Cedric Hale, recently returned from abroad. And his tan and fashionable moustache gave him the appearance of a man accustomed to admiration. He smiled easily, though the smile seldom reached his eyes. Scattered across the lawn were the familiar pillars of village society. Dr. Lionel Pierce, who regarded all human tragedy as a puzzle to be solved through anatomy and reason. Mrs. Eliza Crowthorne, whose capacity for charity was rivaled only by her appetite for scandal. Reverend Matthew Ellison, mild of speech yet watchful. And Clara Whitby, the Barringtons' quiet companion and assistant, who moved discreetly among the guests, ensuring that teacups remained filled. The portrait, it was said, depicted Augustus Barrington, the formidable patriarch who had built Hawthorne Grange into a symbol of authority and taste. And the painting had vanished decades ago under circumstances never quite clarified. Its rediscovery in a London gallery had stirred considerable excitement. "Art," Mrs. Barrington declared, tapping her spoon lightly against her teacup for attention, "is the mirror of legacy, and today we restore ours." Polite applause rippled through the assembly. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest second. Legacy, she had often found, was merely a delicate word for secrets. The silk covering was drawn away. A collective murmur passed through the guests. Augustus Barrington gazed outward from the canvas with dark, penetrating eyes. The artist had captured him mid-expression, his lips slightly parted as though about to issue instruction. The realism was unsettling. There was something almost animate in the stare. The varnish glinted in the afternoon light, and for one peculiar moment the portrait seemed less a memory than a presence. "How extraordinarily lifelike," Mrs. Crowthorne whispered, leaning toward Dr. Pierce. "One almost expects him to blink." Dr. Pierce gave a thin smile. "Paint seldom obliges." Miss Marple regarded the canvas quietly. The eyes were indeed striking, too striking, perhaps. Not merely painted, but intent, observing, assessing. She noticed, too, how Cedric Hale shifted his stance when the cloth fell, a subtle tightening at the jaw, a flicker of discomfort before the social mask returned. And Clara Whitby, dear girl, had grown momentarily pale. "Remarkable, Aunt Honoria," Cedric said brightly, "though I confess I never met the old tyrant." "Your uncle was a visionary," Mrs. Barrington corrected gently. "Visionary," Cedric repeated. "Yes, that is one word." Miss Marple resumed her knitting. "There are moments in village life," she reflected, when the air changes before a storm, though the sky remains deceptively clear. One need not be a meteorologist to recognize it. One has only to have lived long enough among human beings. Tea was served. Compliments were exchanged. The village band attempted a spirited rendition of Green Sleeves. Children chased one another along the hedgerow. And then the scream came. It tore through the lawn with a shrill, unrestrained force, silencing music and conversation alike. Clara Whitby stood near the sycamore tree, her teapot shattered at her feet. Her trembling finger pointed toward the portrait. For a fraction of a second, no one understood. Then Mrs. Barrington swayed. Doctor. The Pierce lunged forward as she collapsed upon the grass, her silk gown pooling like spilled ink. The teacups rattled. Someone cried out for water. Another shouted for space. Miss Marple did not rise immediately. She observed. Dr. Pierce bent low, pressing fingers to Mrs. Barrington's throat. His expression altered, not dramatically, but with the unmistakable gravity of finality. "She's gone," he said. The words seemed not to belong to the afternoon. Reverend Ellison murmured a prayer. Cedric dropped to his knees, grasping his aunt's hand with an urgency that felt almost rehearsed. Mrs. Crowthorne pressed a lace handkerchief to her lips, already calculating the conversational permutations this tragedy would produce. Clara, however, had not lowered her arm. She continued staring at the portrait. Then slowly, so slowly that it might have been imagination, several guests followed her gaze. The painted eyes of Augustus Barrington gleamed in the filtered sunlight, unblinking. Miss Marple rose at last, steadying herself with her knitting bag. She approached the fallen Mrs. Barrington and regarded her with quiet sadness. Then her attention drifted, seemingly idly, to the portrait. A faint smile touched her lips, not of amusement, but of recognition. "Curious," she murmured, to no one in particular, "how certain things return precisely when they are most inconvenient." No one heard her. The village of Stour Field, so recently absorbed in trifles and trifles disguised as importance, now stood on the threshold of something far darker. The unveiling intended to restore legacy had instead resurrected something else entirely. And Miss Marple, gentle and unassuming, had already begun to wonder not who wished Mrs. Barrington dead, but who had feared the portrait most. No one quite knew who gave the first practical instruction, but in the small confusions of a village gathering, the most practical voice usually belonged to the person who least enjoyed raising it. Dr. Pierce straightened, his fingers still faintly damp with the useless check for breath, and said briskly, "Someone run inside and telephone the constable. And if there is a car, fetch it. We must move her from the grass." A ripple of movement followed, guests scattering like startled birds, then reforming in clusters that felt, even to themselves, indecently eager. Mrs. Crowthorne seized the nearest young woman and pushed her toward the house with a hissed whisper that was meant to sound helpful and came out sounding delighted. Reverend Ellison guided two servants to bring a rug. Cedric Hale remained kneeling, his shoulders curved protectively over the lifeless hand he held. Clara Whitby stood rigid by the sycamore tree. She had ceased pointing, but she had not ceased staring. Miss Marple drew nearer, her expression mild, her mouth set in that gentle, sympathetic line villagers found comforting. "My dear," she said softly to Clara, "you'll catch your breath better if you sit down." Clara's eyes fluttered, as though she had forgotten she possessed eyelids at all. She managed. "It was looking at us." Dr. Pierce, hearing that, turned sharply. "My good girl, it's a painting." "I know what a painting is," Clara whispered, with a strange edge to her voice that Miss Marple had not heard in it before. Clara's hands went to her throat, pressing as though the memory of the scream still lived there. "But I saw—" "You saw grief and shock," Dr. Pierce cut in, kinder now that he had asserted authority. "That is all." Miss Marple did not contradict him. She only observed the way Clara's gaze slid, unwillingly, to Cedric Hale, then away again, as though she had looked at him by mistake and feared she had given something away by doing so. Inside Hawthorne Grange, the polished calm of the rooms could not quite conceal the panic that had invaded them. A footman ran for the telephone. A maid wept in the doorway, then was shooed away by the housekeeper, with a glance like a slap. Mrs. Barrington was carried, not with careful solemnity and a great deal of unnecessary muttering, into the drawing-room and laid upon a sofa where she had so often sat upright and composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Now her hands were not folded at all. One lay palm up, as if she had dropped something. The other was curled, the fingers bent slightly inward. Miss Marple drifted in last, as she often did, like someone carried by the current rather than swimming. She placed her knitting bag upon a chair and approached with the others, allowing herself the appearance of frailty that encouraged people to forget her. Dr. Pierce leaned over Mrs. Barrington again, his brow furrowed. "No wounds," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "No sign of a fall that would account for this. It may have been her heart, as though she never mentioned." "She would not," Reverend Ellison said quietly. "She disliked weakness." Cedric's face had gone a peculiar color, too white beneath the tan. He was not weeping. His eyes were wide and bright, but dry. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "My aunt was perfectly well. She was talking about the portrait, for heaven's sake." Mrs. Crowthorne produced a gasp. "Perhaps the shock, dear boy, the strain of entertaining, the excitement, these things tell upon a woman, especially a woman who has had difficulties." "Difficulties," Cedric repeated, turning the word like a blade. Mrs. Crowthorne's eyes darted. "Oh, only, everyone knows Hawthorne Grange hasn't been the same since the portrait disappeared. It was such an old wound." Clara made a small sound then, not quite a sob, and not quite a laugh. Oh, no one looked at her long enough to understand it. Miss Marple, however, did. Outside, the guests had been herded into a kind of stunned order. Some were sent home, some insisted on staying, and some hovered in the hall with the embarrassed persistence of people who felt they had been invited to a drama and did not wish to miss the final act. The servants moved with stiff faces, as though the house itself might punish any display of emotion. A distant bell rang. Someone had finally reached the village constable. The sound of an engine approached, then halted. Boots crossed the gravel. Constable Pritchard arrived with his cap in his hands, and a face trying to look grave while struggling against the instinctive awe a grand house produced in him. Behind him came a man Miss Marple did not know at first glance, a broader figure, older, as with an air of practiced irritation at being summoned to countryside emergencies. "That'll be Inspector Slack," Mrs. Crowthorne whispered to no one in particular, and sounded almost pleased to be right about something. Inspector Slack entered the drawing-room, glanced at the body, and then at the gathered faces. His eyes, quick and shrewd, took in the silk gown, the fine furniture, the concerned clergyman, the local doctor, and the handsome nephew in a posture of grief that seemed, in its very neatness, a touch artificial. "Dr. Pierce," Slack said, as though the name had been handed to him on the doorstep. "Cause of death?" "Not yet certain," Dr. Pierce admitted. "She fell suddenly. No visible injury. If you permit me, I'd like to examine her more thoroughly in private." "You'll do that," Slack said. But we'll keep the room as it is for now." Cedric rose. His movements were controlled, almost too controlled. "Inspector, you must understand. This was a gathering. People everywhere. My aunt was among friends." Slack's gaze flicked to him. "Friends can be the worse for a person." That remark caused a small shifting in the room, an offended rustle, a tightening of lips. The inspector walked to the window and looked out over the lawn where the white marquee still stood like a mocking symbol of celebration. Then he turned. "Who found her?" Who was closest? A series of answers tumbled out, half overlapping, half contradicting. Mrs. Crowthorne spoke at length. Reverend Ellison tried to clarify. Dr. Pierce corrected. A servant stammered. In the midst of it, Clara Whitby suddenly stepped forward. She collapsed when the cloth came off, Clara said. Her voice was steadier now, though her hands trembled at her sides. It was right after the portrait was revealed. Slack's eyes narrowed. So you're telling me a painting killed her? Clara swallowed. No, I'm telling you the moment. Slack seemed about to dismiss her, but something in the way she held herself, too rigid, too braced, made him pause. And you screamed, he said. Why? Clara's gaze slid again toward the doorway, as if she expected the portrait to be there, watching them even from the corridor. Because I saw something. Dr. Pierce made an impatient sound. Inspector, she's in shock. She's been under strain in this house for months. Mrs. Barrington relied upon her excessively. Slack held up a hand. Let her speak. Clara's lips moved, but no words came. Then, and as if forcing it out hurt, she said, The eyes, She shut them briefly, as though to erase the image. They looked wet. A small silence followed, heavy with disbelief. Wet, Slack repeated. Like someone had touched them, Clara said, and then, in a rush, like a thumb had smeared the varnish. Miss Marple's needles were in her hands again, clicking softly, though she did not appear to look at them. Her expression remained mild, but her mind had gone very still. A thumbprint, she thought, or the idea of one. Slack regarded Clara for a long moment, then nodded as though filing the statement away. All right, he said. We'll have a look. He turned toward the hall, his boots firm on the polished floor. Several people moved to follow as if drawn by the promise of purpose. Cedric hesitated, then went too, his face set. And Miss Marple followed last, as always. In the corridor, the air felt cooler, and the house's long stillness pressed in from the walls. The portrait had been carried inside after the collapse. Someone had thought it improper to leave a valuable painting outdoors. It now stood propped upon an easel near the entry to the library, the gilded frame catching lamplight. Augustus Barrington stared outward with the same intent expression. The eyes were as dark as ever, untroubled, confident. Slack stepped close and leaned in, angling his head, his breath fogged faintly against the varnish. He lifted a finger, then stopped short of touching. Don't put your hands on it, he snapped automatically to the constable who had edged nearer. Dr. Pierce peered, squinting. It's just the light. No, Clara said, and there was desperate certainty in it. It was there. Slack examined the painted face with an impatience that was almost anger at the absurdity of the task. Then his expression changed slightly, not to belief exactly, but to interest. He reached into his pocket, produced a small handkerchief, and held it close to the surface without touching. See that? He said. No one spoke. Even Mrs. Crowthorne's breath seemed to catch. On the dark glaze near the lower edge of one painted eye, there was indeed a faint disturbance. So slight it could have been nothing, so deliberate it could not be dismissed. A smear, perhaps, or a print. Miss Marple looked at it and thought of Clara's scream, of Cedric's tightened jaw when the cloth came off, and of Mrs. Barrington's phrase, "Art is the mirror of legacy." Legacy, she reflected, could be altered, and so could a painting. Slack straightened. All right, he said, his voice brusque to cover the unease that had crept in. Nobody goes near this. Nobody goes anywhere without telling me. Constable, keep someone at this door. He turned his gaze on the group, letting it land one by one on faces that had only an hour ago been smiling over tea. Now, he said, tell me about this portrait, where it's been, who brought it back, and why today of all days. Miss Marple's knitting clicked on, steady as a metronome, while inside her mind the first threads of pattern began to gather, softly, subtly, as though she were only making conversation. Inspector Slack did not permit the company to disperse far. The guests who had not already fled were guided, firmly but with a certain rustic courtesy, into the morning room overlooking the east lawn. And the late afternoon light had begun its slow decline, casting long, accusatory shadows across the parquet floor. Outside, the marquee sagged slightly at one corner, as though exhausted by the drama it had hosted. Slack positioned himself by the mantel, a stance that allowed him to see every face without appearing theatrical. Constable Pritchard stood near the door, notebook poised with an earnestness that suggested he feared missing history in the making. "Let's keep this simple," Slack began. "The portrait turns up after years missing. It's unveiled. Within moments, Mrs. Barrington collapses and dies. One witness says she saw a smear, possibly a thumb mark on the painting's eye. I want to know who handled it, who arranged its return, and who knew about it beforehand." Cedric Hale answered at once, as though he had prepared himself for the role. "I located it in London 3 months ago, in a small gallery in Bloomsbury. It was misattributed, listed merely as Portrait of a Gentleman circa 1890. I recognized my grandfather immediately." "Recognized him," Slack repeated, "despite never having met him." Cedric's smile was swift and sharp. "Family resemblance, and we have photographs." Miss Marple, seated near the window with her knitting resting idle in her lap, noted that the smile vanished the instant Slack looked away. "Who handled the painting after you bought it?" Slack continued. "It was restored professionally," Cedric said. "Cleaned, revarnished, reframed. I supervised the process." "Name of the restorer?" Cedric supplied it without hesitation. Dr. Pierce nodded faintly. "A reputable man. I've seen his work." Slack grunted. "And after restoration?" "It was delivered here last week," Cedric said. "Crated. The servants brought it inside. Clara oversaw the placement." All eyes shifted to Clara Whitby. She sat upright, her hands folded tightly together. The pallor from earlier had not entirely left her face, but there was something steadier beneath it now, an effort at composure. "Yes," she said. "The crate was opened in the hall. Mr. Hale and I were present. The footman lifted it onto the easel. It remained covered until today." "You didn't touch the surface?" Slack asked. "No," Clara said. "Only the frame, and that through gloves. The restorer warned us not to disturb the varnish." Slack looked toward the servants gathered nervously near the door. One stepped forward at a nod. "We didn't touch the paint, sir. Only the crate. And Miss Whitby was particular about it." Slack's gaze returned to Cedric. Why unveil it publicly? Why not hang it quietly and be done? Cedric's jaw tightened again, a gesture Miss Marple was beginning to recognize as involuntary. "Because it belonged here, because its disappearance was a blemish. My aunt believed restoring it would silence certain rumors." "Rumors?" Reverend Ellison echoed gently. Cedric's eyes flickered, then hardened. "Nonsense about inheritance disputes, about my grandfather disinheriting someone. Idle village talk." Mrs. Crowthorne inhaled faintly, the sound almost devotional. "Well, there was that unfortunate business with his younger brother." "Mrs. Crowthorne," Slack said sharply, "we'll come to old scandals in good time." Miss Marple observed Clara at that moment, and the younger woman's fingers had begun to press against one another, thumb to thumb, as if testing for some remembered sensation. Not fear exactly, more like anticipation. "Tell me about the day the portrait vanished originally," Slack said, turning his attention to Mrs. Barrington's contemporaries. Dr. Pierce cleared his throat. "It was before my practice began here, but I've heard the tale often enough. Augustus Barrington quarreled with his brother, Henry. There were allegations of financial impropriety. Shortly after Henry left the village, the portrait disappeared. Some said it was stolen. Others suggested Augustus himself ordered it removed. "And Henry?" Slack asked. "Died abroad," Reverend Ellison replied. "Childless, as far as we know." Cedric shifted in his chair. This is ancient history." "History has a way of staying put," Slack said, "particularly when it concerns money." Miss Marple's knitting resumed softly. Money, she thought, was seldom ancient. Slack began taking statements more formally, one by one. Timelines were recounted. The guest's arrival, the placement of the easel beneath the sycamore, the moment the cloth was drawn back. Each account overlapped the other, forming a tapestry of minor contradictions. Who stood nearest? Who gasped first? Whether Mrs. Barrington had said anything immediately before collapsing. It was Clara's turn again when Slack reached the crucial moment. "You say she swayed?" he prompted. "Yes," Clara replied. She had just said something about legacy. Then she looked at the portrait, at the eyes, and her expression changed. Changed how? Clara hesitated. Not fear, recognition. The word seemed to settle heavily into the room. Recognition of what? Slack pressed. "I don't know," Clara said, but it was as if she had seen something she hadn't expected. Cedric rose abruptly. "This is absurd. My aunt was elderly. She was excited. Perhaps her heart failed. Must we invent melodrama?" Slack's eyes sharpened. "Sit down, Mr. Hale." Cedric complied, though the compliance carried strain. Miss Marple glanced toward the corridor where the portrait stood guarded. She recalled the faint disturbance on the varnish, the suggestion of contact, and she remembered Clara's first instinct, not to rush to Mrs. Barrington, but to point. One does not scream at a smudge, she reflected. One screams at implication. Slack finished his notes and closed the small book with a decisive snap. "Until Dr. Sir Pierce gives me something more definite, we proceed on the assumption this was not natural causes." A collective breath was drawn. "No one leaves the village," Slack added, "and no one approaches that painting." As the constable escorted the servants away for individual questioning, the guests dispersed in uneasy pairs. Reverend Ellison murmured prayers. Mrs. Crowthorne whispered vigorously into the ear of a neighbor. Cedric stood alone by the fireplace, staring into its unlit grate as if calculating flames. Clara remained seated. Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed to her, the soft rustle of her cardigan the only announcement. "My dear," she said kindly, "one often finds that what appears alarming at first becomes quite ordinary upon closer inspection." Clara looked up sharply. "Do you believe that?" "Not always," Miss Marple admitted. But it is comforting to pretend so, for a time." Clara's composure wavered. "I know what I saw." "I do not doubt you," Miss Marple said gently. "The question is not what you saw, but what it meant." Clara's eyes flickered toward Cedric again, briefly, involuntarily. Miss Marple followed the glance, then let her own gaze drift innocently elsewhere. Outside, the light had faded to a bruised lavender. The sycamore tree stood black against the sky, its branches skeletal. Somewhere in the house, a door closed with quiet finality. Dr. Pierce emerged from the drawing room at last, his face grave. Inspector Slack met him halfway. "Well?" he asked. Dr. Pierce removed his spectacles and polished them with slow deliberation, a habit Miss Marple recognized as a shield against delivering unwelcome truth. "There is no sign of heart failure," he said quietly. "But there is something else." The room seemed to contract around his words. "A faint discoloration at the lips," he continued, "and a trace, very faint, of bitter almond." Slack's expression hardened instantly. "Poison?" he said. Dr. Pierce inclined his head. "I believe so." In the hush that followed, Miss Marple felt the pattern tighten another thread. If Mrs. Barrington had been poisoned, It had been before she collapsed, before the unveiling, before the scream. Her gaze drifted once more to the hall where Augustus Barrington's painted eyes waited, steady, inscrutable, and unblinking. The words seemed to linger in the air long after Dr. Pierce had spoken it. Poison. Mrs. Crowthorne gave a soft cry and immediately pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, as though her eyes shone with something perilously close to fascination. Reverend Ellison bowed his head. Cedric did not move at all. He stood as if the sound had struck him into marble. Inspector Slack recovered first. Cyanide? He asked curtly. Possibly, Dr. Pierce replied. The scent is faint and not everyone detects it. I'll require proper analysis, of course. But the signs are consistent. Slack turned sharply toward the assembled group. What did she consume? There was a brief confusion of recollection. Tea had been poured, cake sliced, small sandwiches passed. Several voices spoke at once. A servant was summoned to clarify. Mrs. Barrington took tea only, sir, the maid said nervously. From the silver service. I poured it myself. Sugar? Slack asked. 1 lump, as always. Milk? A dash. Slack looked toward the tray that had been carried in with the body. Bring it here. The teacup was placed upon a side table. It still contained a shallow pool of amber liquid. Slack leaned close but did not touch it. Anyone else drink from this pot? Yes, Mrs. Crowthorne said quickly. We all did. It was passed along the table. Dr. Pierce frowned. Yet no one else has collapsed. Which suggests, Slack said slowly, that whatever was administered was in her cup specifically. Silence followed that deduction, thick and accusing. Cedric spoke at last. That's impossible. The tea was poured in plain view. Clara's voice came quietly from across the room. Not entirely. All heads turned toward her. There was a moment, she said carefully, just before the unveiling. Mrs. Barrington asked me to fetch the speech she had written. I went inside for perhaps 2 minutes. When I returned, the guests were rearranging themselves for the cloth to be drawn back. Her cup was on the table beside the easel. You're suggesting, Slack said, that someone approached it while you were absent. I'm saying I did not see who might have, Clara replied. Miss Marple watched the exchange with mild attention, though her mind was far from idle. 2 minutes, she thought, is quite sufficient for someone prepared. Slack began issuing instructions with renewed sharpness. No one leaves the house. Constable, see that the kitchen is secured. I want every cup, every spoon, every sugar bowl accounted for. As the constable hurried out, Slack faced the room again. We proceed methodically, one by one. You'll tell me where you were in those 2 minutes. Statements were given with varying degrees of confidence. Mrs. Crowthorne insisted she had been adjusting her hat in the reflection of the drawing-room window. Reverend Ellison had been speaking to Dr. Pierce about the hymn selection for Sunday. Dr. Pierce confirmed it. Cedric claimed he had been examining the portrait's frame, checking that it stood securely. Alone? Slack asked. Yes, Cedric replied, too quickly. Alone. Clara lowered her gaze. Miss Marple noted the sequence carefully. Cedric near the portrait, the teacup on the table beside it. Clara absent, Mrs. Barrington standing a short distance away, greeting guests. Did Mrs. Barrington consume anything else today? Slack asked Dr. Pierce. Not to my knowledge. She had luncheon at 1, Clara said softly. I prepared it. A cold chicken, salad, and lemonade. I tasted everything. And you suffered no ill effects, Slack observed. No. The inspector nodded, then turned his attention back to the teacup. We'll have this tested. Until then, assume she was targeted. Targeted. The word struck the room like a stone dropped into still water. Mrs. Crowthorne whispered, But who would wish such a thing? Miss Marple's needles clicked faintly in response. Who indeed? Her thoughts returned to the moment of unveiling, the subtle tightening in Cedric's jaw, Clara's pallor, Mrs. Barrington's altered expression. Recognition, Clara had said. Recognition of what? Inspector, Miss Marple ventured mildly. May I ask, was there any discoloration on the hands? Slack looked at her, faintly surprised by the question from so gentle a figure. Why do you ask? Oh, no reason, she said, only that certain poisons, when administered in liquid, sometimes leave a trace upon the fingers if the cup is steadied in a particular manner. Dr. Pierce glanced up. There was a faint stain on the thumb and forefinger of her right hand. I assumed it was tea. Perhaps it was, Miss Marple said agreeably. Slack's eyes sharpened, or perhaps she touched something else. A small current of unease moved through the company. Such as? Cedric demanded. The painting, Slack said flatly. All eyes turned instinctively toward the hall. Dr. Pierce shook his head. That seems improbable. Does it? Slack replied. We have a smear on the varnish near the eye. We have a woman who collapses moments after gazing at it, and we have poison. Clara's breathing quickened. Miss Marple spoke again, her tone as mild as cream. One must be cautious, Inspector, not to confuse sequence with cause. If Mrs. Barrington had already consumed the poison, her collapse might merely have coincided with the unveiling. Slack regarded her thoughtfully. Meaning? Meaning the portrait may have been intended as distraction rather than instrument. Cedric's gaze snapped toward her. Distraction from what? He said. From the act itself, Miss Marple replied. The room seemed to tighten. Slack folded his arms. You suggest the unveiling created the perfect moment. Eyes directed elsewhere. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Village fêtes are wonderfully convenient for that sort of thing. Everyone believes they are watching the important event. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside, the last of the daylight faded entirely. Lamps were lit, and casting a golden glow that felt at odds with the chill that had settled over the house. A servant entered quietly. Inspector, the kitchen is secured. The sugar bowl. She hesitated. There appears to be a spoon missing. Slack's head turned slowly. Missing? Yes, sir. There were 3 earlier. Now only 2 remain. The detail was small, almost trivial, but in a room already strained by suspicion, it carried weight. Slack's expression hardened once more. Find it. The servant hurried away. Miss Marple felt another thread tighten into place. A missing spoon, a private moment, a carefully orchestrated unveiling. She rose slowly from her chair and moved toward the doorway, as though merely seeking better light. Mrs. Marple, Slack called, where were you in those 2 minutes? She paused, looking faintly apologetic. By the hydrangeas, Inspector, admiring the petals. They suffer terribly from mildew if not attended to. Did you observe anyone near Mrs. Barrington's cup? Miss Marple considered, her gaze drifting inward. I observed many things, she said gently, though not always what one expects. Cedric exhaled sharply. This is absurd speculation. Is it? Slack said. At that moment, Clara rose abruptly. Inspector, she said, her voice steadier than before. May I speak with you privately? Every face turned toward her. Slack hesitated, then nodded. Very well. As he followed her toward the library, Miss Marple watched the girl's back. Straight, determined. The door closed behind them with a muted click. In the hush that followed, Cedric moved toward the window, staring out into the darkened lawn, where the sycamore's branches twisted like ink against the night sky. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, though she did not look at it. The unveiling had indeed drawn every eye. But sometimes, she reflected, the most important gesture is the one made while everyone is looking elsewhere. The murmur in the morning room subsided after Clara and Inspector Slack disappeared into the library. Conversation resumed in fragments, low, strained, incomplete. No one wished to appear eager, yet no one could entirely disguise the anticipation that accompanies confession. Cedric remained at the window, his silhouette dark against the lamplight. Reverend Ellison stood near the hearth, hands clasped as though in silent appeal. Mrs. Crowthorne leaned toward Dr. Pierce, whispering furiously, and though she fell silent whenever Miss Marple's gentle gaze drifted near. Time passed slowly, measured not by clocks but by the tension in the room. At last the library door opened. Clara emerged first. Her composure had altered, not restored, but hardened. Inspector Slack followed, his expression less brusque and more deliberate than before. "Thank you," he said to Clara, loud enough for the room to hear. "That will be all for now." Cedric turned sharply. "What did she say?" Slack did not answer immediately. He crossed the room and took up his position once more by the mantel. "Miss Whitby has clarified a detail regarding the portrait's restoration." The word restoration seemed to ripple faintly. "What detail?" Cedric demanded. "She informed me," Slack continued evenly, "that when the painting arrived from London, there was a slight delay before it was unpacked. A private inspection, she called it, conducted by you." Cedric's expression flickered. Irritation first, then something less easily named. "Naturally, I wished to ensure it had not been damaged in transit." "Alone?" Slack asked again. "Yes." "And you handled it?" "Only the frame." Clara's voice, quiet but unmistakable, cut across the space. "You asked me to fetch gloves." Cedric's head snapped toward her. "Which you did." "Yes," Clara replied steadily. "But when I returned, the crate was already open." The room seemed to contract once more. "You're implying," Cedric began, but Slack lifted a hand. "Let us be precise," the inspector said. "Miss Whitby states that when she re-entered the hall, and you were standing very close to the painting, close enough that your hand was raised toward the canvas." Cedric laughed, short, incredulous. "This is absurd. I may have leaned in. Anyone would." Miss Marple watched him carefully. The laughter lacked warmth. It rang brittle, like glass under strain. "Did you touch the varnish?" Slack asked. "No." Clara hesitated, then added, "I noticed a faint mark near the eye even then. I assumed it was part of the restoration process." Silence. Dr. Pierce cleared his throat. "Inspector, surely we cannot suppose poison was applied to a painting. Cyanide degrades quickly in air." "Quite so," Slack agreed, "but not if applied in a more stable form." Miss Marple's needles paused mid-click. Cedric's composure slipped a fraction. "This is lunacy." "Is it?" Slack's tone sharpened. "We have a smear on the varnish. We have poison, and we have a missing spoon." At the mention of the spoon, the maid reappeared, pale and breathless. "Inspector, it's been found." "Where?" "In the shrubbery beneath the sycamore, sir, near where the easel stood." Every face turned instinctively toward the darkened lawn beyond the glass. Slack extended his hand. The maid placed the small silver spoon upon a folded napkin. It gleamed innocently in the lamplight. Dr. Pierce leaned closer. "Residue." "We'll have it tested," Slack said. "But its presence there is interesting." Cedric's voice cut in, strained now. Anyone could have dropped it. "Of course," Slack replied. "During the unveiling, for instance, when all eyes were raised." Miss Marple felt the threads tightening further. She rose quietly and approached the spoon, peering at it with apparent vagueness. "How clumsy of someone," she murmured. "Sugar does make one careless." Slack glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "Oh, nothing at all," she said. "Only that one sometimes sees a guest add sugar at the last moment, after the cup has been set down. A small adjustment made swiftly, so as not to delay proceedings." Cedric stared at her. Dr. Pierce frowned. "If poison were concealed in sugar, It would dissolve almost at once. Slack finished. The implications hung in the air. Clara spoke again, her voice steady now with something approaching resolve. Mrs. Barrington did not stir her tea immediately. She was distracted by greeting Mrs. Crowthorne. Her cup remained untouched for several moments. And in that interval, Slack said softly, as someone might have approached. Cedric's gaze moved from Clara to Slack to Miss Marple. This is turning into a grotesque performance. Miss Marple met his eyes kindly. Village life can be theatrical, Mr. Hale, especially when old matters are revived. Old matters, he echoed. Yes, she said. You mentioned earlier that the portrait's disappearance had been inconvenient. That rumors followed. Cedric's jaw tightened once more. Idle nonsense. Rumors about inheritance, Mrs. Crowthorne interjected before she could stop herself. About a will. Slack seized on it. What will? Reverend Ellison shifted uncomfortably. Augustus Barrington's original will was said to favor his younger brother. Shortly before his death it was amended. And the portrait vanished around that time, Slack added. Cedric's composure cracked then, so if only slightly. My grandfather revised his will for practical reasons. Henry was unreliable. Yet the painting, symbol of legacy, disappeared, Miss Marple said gently. A curious coincidence. Slack turned sharply toward Cedric. If the portrait had contained evidence of some kind, something your aunt recognized upon seeing it. That is pure fantasy, Cedric snapped, but Clara's eyes widened faintly, as though a door had opened in her mind. Evidence, she whispered. Miss Marple tilted her head. Artists are observant creatures. They capture more than likeness. Sometimes they include details their subjects would prefer forgotten. The room seemed suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Slack's gaze hardened. We'll examine the painting under proper light. If there's anything concealed beneath the varnish, we'll find it. Cedric took a step back, the movement subtle but unmistakable. Miss Marple noticed. Outside, wind stirred the branches of the sycamore, brushing them against the window with a faint, rasping sound. Poison in the cup. A missing spoon discarded hastily, a smear upon the portrait, and perhaps, just perhaps, something in the painting itself that had startled Mrs. Barrington into recognition before the poison completed its work. Slack gestured to the constable. Prepare the library. We'll inspect it now. As the company began to move toward the hall once more, Miss Marple lingered a moment behind them. Her gaze drifted to Clara, whose face now held not fear, but dawning comprehension. Yes, Miss Marple murmured softly, almost to herself. Aye, it is rarely the obvious feature one must study, but the background. And with that quiet thought, she followed the others toward the unblinking eyes waiting in the lamplight. The library had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom, though no one had formally declared it so. Lamps had been drawn closer, their light concentrated upon the portrait propped upright before the bookshelves. The rest of the room lay in softened shadow, as if unwilling to intrude upon what was about to unfold. Inspector Slack stood near the painting, arms folded. Dr. Pierce hovered beside him. Reverend Ellison, Mrs. Crowthorne, Clara Whitby, and Cedric Hale formed a loose semicircle. Miss Marple sat slightly apart, hands folded over her knitting, her expression one of mild attentiveness. The portrait of Augustus Barrington gazed out at them all. Under stronger light, the faint disturbance near the painted eye was more apparent. Not dramatic, merely a slight irregularity in the varnish, as though something had been pressed there and hastily withdrawn. Slack had already arranged for the surface to be examined carefully. No dramatic mechanism had sprung forth, no hidden compartment had revealed itself. Yet something else, something subtler, had come to light. Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, might we tilt it slightly? Slack obliged, angling the frame so that the light struck across the surface rather than directly upon it. A murmur rippled through the room. There, faint but undeniable beneath the translucent glaze, was a detail most had not noticed before. In the background, just over Augustus Barrington's shoulder, a small table had been painted. Upon it lay a folded document, partially obscured by shadow, but not entirely obscured. The painter had rendered enough to make out a name, Henry Barrington, written in a firm, deliberate hand. Cedric's breath caught audibly. "It's merely decorative," he said quickly. "An artistic flourish." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied mildly. "And yet the date inscribed beside it corresponds not to Augustus's final will, but to an earlier one." Dr. Pierce stared. "You mean—" "I mean," Miss Marple continued, "that the portrait inadvertently preserved evidence of Augustus Barrington's original testament, the one said to favor his younger brother." Reverend Ellison's face paled. "Good heavens." Cedric laughed again, though the sound was thin. "This proves nothing. A painted document is not a legal instrument." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But it does prove that such a document existed at the time the portrait was completed. And if Mrs. Barrington believed the later amendment was beyond dispute, seeing this might have caused her considerable alarm." Slack's gaze shifted to Cedric. "Particularly," Miss Marple added softly, "if someone stood to lose a great deal should the existence of that earlier will be re-examined." The silence that followed was absolute. Cedric's face had drained of color. "This is absurd conjecture." "Is it?" Miss Marple's tone remained as gentle as ever. "You located the portrait in London. You supervised its restoration privately. You handled it before anyone else saw it. And when the cloth was drawn back this afternoon, your aunt looked not merely startled, but recognizing." Clara spoke quietly. She stepped closer, as if to confirm what she was seeing. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And you, Mr. Hale, were nearest her teacup during those crucial moments before the unveiling." Cedric's eyes flashed. "You have no proof." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "On the contrary, the spoon recovered from the shrubbery contains traces consistent with cyanide, and your fingerprints are upon it." The words struck like a hammer. Cedric staggered half a step backward. "That proves only that I used it for sugar." "It proves," Slack said evenly, "that you handled it shortly before it was discarded, and the smear on the varnish bears the same trace. You tested the poison there first, didn't you? A small amount applied to ensure potency." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "You intended the portrait to serve two purposes. First, to eliminate Mrs. Barrington before she could react publicly to what she recognized. And second, to create confusion, suggesting the painting itself somehow caused her collapse." Cedric's composure fractured entirely then. "She was going to reopen everything," he burst out. "She had been speaking with solicitors. She suspected something after I brought the portrait back. If that earlier will were proven, you would not inherit Hawthorne Grange." Reverend Ellison finished quietly. Cedric's expression hardened into something almost defiant. "I restored what was mine by right." "By poisoning your aunt?" Clara's voice trembled, not with fear now, but with outrage. Cedric turned on her. "You would never have understood. You were nothing more than her shadow." Slack moved swiftly then, stepping between them. That will do." For a moment it seemed Cedric might attempt further protest, but the weight of the evidence, the spoon, the poison, the motive preserved in paint, pressed down upon him. His shoulders sagged. "I only meant to frighten her at first," he muttered. "The smear on the portrait. I thought she might doubt her own eyes. But when I realized, she recognized the document." His voice faltered. "You added the poison to her cup while Clara fetched the speech," Miss Marple said gently, "knowing the unveiling would distract everyone." Cedric said nothing. Inspector Slack signaled to Constable Pritchard, who stepped forward and took Cedric firmly by the arm. There was no struggle now. As he was led toward the door, Cedric glanced once more at the portrait, at the painted eyes of Augustus Barrington, unblinking as ever. Then he was gone, and the library seemed to exhale. Clara sank into a chair, her strength finally giving way. Reverend Ellison murmured a prayer under his breath. Mrs. Crowthorne dabbed at tears that were, for once, sincere. Inspector Slack turned to Miss Marple. "You saw it early on, didn't you?" "Oh, no," she replied modestly. "I merely observed that people often reveal themselves when they believe attention is elsewhere, and that artists, like gossips, sometimes record more than intended." Dr. Pierce shook his head in quiet admiration. "It was the background you noticed." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "The important things are so often placed behind us." Later, when the house had emptied and the police carriage had disappeared down the lane, Hawthorne Grange stood once more in uneasy stillness. The portrait remained in the library, and its secrets no longer hidden. Miss Marple stepped out onto the lawn before departing. The sycamore tree rustled gently overhead. The marquee had been taken down. Only flattened grass remained as evidence of the day's celebration. Clara joined her quietly. "I thought it was the eyes," she said, "that they meant something terrible." "They did," Miss Marple replied kindly. "But not because they blinked or failed to. They simply reminded someone of what he wished forgotten." Clara nodded slowly. The village of Stourfield would speak of this for years, of poison in teacups, of a portrait that preserved the truth, of inheritance and betrayal. Yet in time, hedgerows would bloom again, and tea would be poured without suspicion. Miss Marple adjusted her cardigan and prepared to make her way home. Human nature, she reflected softly, yes, is remarkably consistent. One may change the setting, a garden party, a grand estate, a painted legacy, but the motives remain comfortingly familiar. Behind her, through the library window, Augustus Barrington's painted gaze remained steady, unblinking, and at last fully understood.